Today we are looking at the unsolved killing of a young woman named Mary Lee in a Midwestern river town in 1911, a case that tangled church steps, rail yards, and a city just learning electric light. She left work beneath new street lamps, carrying a hymn book and a note folded into her glove. By dawn, her hat lay in a cinder alley and her locket was gone, but not the questions that follow us. Witnesses remember a carriage that shouldn't have been there, a phone call that crossed a line on the switchboard, and a boot print with a strange nail pattern that fit no easy suspect yet refused to fade. You're watching True Crime Files. Don't forget to subscribe for more cases like this. The year is 1911, late autumn, when the Ohio River breathes cold over the floodwall and the rails hum at night. Paducah, Kentucky, is a hinge of steamboats and freight trains, a place of new electric bulbs and old habits. On Maple Street, a boarding house keeps its lamps low and its stair treads polished with beeswax. Mary Lee has the back corner room with the narrow bed and the little vase that holds one pressed clover, a quiet detail that will matter later. She is 26, a seamstress by day at the Ford and Brunner Garment Works, a steady alto at First Methodist on Sundays. Her landlady, Mrs. Calder, calls her the clock, because Mary keeps people on time with the neatness of her habits. Pay envelope on Fridays, supper at a small table by the window, a walk to choir practice with her hymn book in a cloth cover. She is engaged, not formally announced, to a rail brakeman named Frank Malloy, and the city assumes it will be a spring wedding if money allows. The week it begins, a rain front trails off and the streets dry in scalloped patches, leaving black grit along the gutters. The garment shop posts overtime until 9 to finish a shipment, the whistle releases the women into the brisk air, and the switchboard at City Exchange hums as calls stack and crackle. Down the block, Grubb's Pharmacy sells penny licorice and liver pills, and beside the register sits a pay telephone with a brass mouthpiece and a coin slot that jams unless you know the trick. Mary carries her hymn book because choir rehearsal is after supper, and the church basement smells of starch and damp coal. She signs out from the shop at 8:57 p.m., according to the foreman's log, then stops by the bakery for a heel end of rye for the morning. On Maple Street she climbs to her room and leaves the book on the dresser, then returns to the hall to fetch a shawl. This is what the landlady remembers, and perhaps she is right, perhaps she recollects the clack of heels as a metronome that later sounds like warning. By 9:30 she is seen near the church's side lawn, speaking with a man near the low iron fence. The witness is a milkman finishing his route, and he tells the sheriff he recognized the man's cap more than his face. "Driver's cap," he says, tapping the brim of an invisible hat. "Livery sort, not a newsboy," which narrows little in a town where horses still outnumber automobiles, yet it places a wheel in the night. At 10:05, the switchboard operator at City Exchange, Lila McKee, 19, hair pinned too tightly for the long shift, records a crossline fragment. Two voices bump into each other when plugs are misseated. On Lila's paper, in pencil, are 4 words, rear gate. 10 o'clock. She adds a question mark because she is not certain who said it or to whom, only that the whisper carried urgency and a hush that made her press her lip with her teeth. Sometime between 10 and 11, a small carriage moves north along 3rd Street, narrow wheels hissing in the grit as if the driver is minding the sound. A woman at a second-story window hears hoofbeats hesitate, then continue. She thinks of nothing until morning. It is what we do when a detail is lonely and we cannot yet give it a story. At first light a pair of schoolboys cut through the alley behind the Baptist church, swapping marbles and lies. One of them trips and looks down to fault the ground. He sees a hat with rain-beaded velvet and a snapped hatpin like a little spear. 4 steps farther, a scuffed shoe print shows the arc of hobnails across the heel, a crescent like a capital letter, stamped twice, left then right. The boys run, differently now, carrying a shape that will not shrink. Sheriff Abel Carter walks the alley with his shoulders set under his wool coat. With him is Marshal Wynn of the city police, a man who chews clove gum and says little in the cold. They find Mary wedged along the fence line between a stack of cinders and a crate that once held apples. Her scarf is pulled tight, the doctor will later say it was not the final harm but part of a sequence. No locket at her throat. No coin purse. The hymn book is missing, and those who loved her will care about the hymn book as if a song can refuse the dark. Dr. Julius Whitlow bends over her in a woolen cap and writes times in a small book. He says the position of the wrist suggests restraint without rope, pressure by hands, a jerking motion he has seen when men fight by the river. He lifts a strand of hair and rubs it between his fingers like a miller testing flour. The black grit that comes away is creosote, he claims, the preservative that floods the ties along the rail spur behind Brunner's warehouse. The smell confirms it. The alley, then the yard, then the rails, a sequence that invites a walk. Investigators follow the cinder trail until the grit breaks into thin dust at the spur. A conductor in a wool vest watches them and tells a story before they ask. He saw a man in a dark coat near the coupling chain after 10, he says, smoking as if he did not want the match flare to show his face. When he finished, he flicked the match into a puddle. The puddle steamed, and the man laughed alone. The conductor swears to it. Sometimes witnesses lace fear into a story to make it hold. Mary's room at the boarding house becomes a museum by noon. Women come with flowers and leave them on the windowsill. Mrs. Calder straightens a hairbrush as if she can correct the day's tilt with its bristles. In Mary's glove, in the small drawer, the sheriff finds a pawn ticket stamped with Harris Loan Office, 2 blocks off the river, dated 3 days ago. The item is listed as gold oval locket, initials ML. The reason is not listed. Reasons rarely are. At Harris's, the owner opens a drawer and lays the locket in the light. Inside the oval is a pressed clover and a photograph of a baby no more than 6 months old, in the universal stiff lace collar of every studio in every town. Harris says Mary did not want to pawn it but did. She promised to return with money on Friday. The sheriff asks the question for us, why part with the one thing she clearly treasured, and why now? Inquiries fan across the town in lines like the streetcar routes. Frank Malloy, the fiancé, says he worked the late freight through Metropolis on the Illinois side. He can show the conductor's ledger, but it records cargo, not promises. He says Mary had been quiet lately, not ill, just far away. He claims she meant to tell him something after choir practice this Thursday. In a careful voice he adds that they had quarreled about a man who visited her, Roy Harlan, a clerk at the county office. Malloy does not explain how he knows that name. Roy Harlan says he went by with tax forms and saw nothing unusual. He says he found Mary severe and good, the sort of goodness that reminds a man to look at his own hands. He delays when asked if he walked her to the church lawn. He denies it. In denial there is always a seam, and it gnaws at Sheriff Carter like a mouse at flour sacks. The city exchange operator Lila comes to the courthouse with her pencil stub and her neat paper. She tells of the whisper and the hour. She says she always writes fragments that sound like arrangements. Rear gate. 10 o'clock, she repeats, those same 4 words. When asked which line she was routing, she hesitates, then names the Grubbs Pharmacy pay telephone. The sheriff's men walk at once to the drugstore and ask for the ledger where calls are tallied in pencil for the proprietor's end-of-day count. There is, indeed, a smudged mark near 10 p.m., the digits 0.05, and the initial M, which might mean miscellaneous, or merchants, or the boredom of a clerk's shorthand. It is enough to keep the door open. The search widens. A livery stable on Broadway reports that a 2-wheeled cab was rented by a man with a driver's cap but a stonemason's hands, the palms gloved and calloused even through leather. The mane is described, the horse remembered as a kicker who hates flags. The cab returns scuffed with cinder grit and a smudge of creosote along the axle. The stable boy shrugs. He cleans it off with a rag and turpentine and throws the rag into the firebox. Evidence, met by winter. A week later, a boy fishing the edge of the levee with bread for bait pulls up a cloth cover that once wrapped a small book. It smells faintly of lemon and starch. The words, First Methodist, are faintly penciled on the inside. The book itself is gone. The river offers back what it wants and keeps the rest, as if the case has found an officiant who speaks in currents. The boy becomes part of the story whether he wants it or not. The coroner's inquest convenes in the courtroom above the clerk's office, where the windows fog with breath in the afternoon. Dr. Whitlow testifies that Mary died between 10 and midnight. He lists bruising patterns and the scarf, careful to say only what he can see. He adds one more fact that shifts the room: Mary had been 2 or 3 months pregnant. The word moves like wind through wheat, and the foreman of the jury looks down at his knuckles. The whispered question is not who would kill, but who would be most desperate to keep a secret in a town that keeps everything. The names resurface: the fiancé, the county clerk's deputy, the livery driver with a cap and calloused hands, and a late addition, the pastor who counsels choir singers in the parsonage with the door just ajar. Reverend Ezra Clayton admits to meeting Mary one afternoon to discuss a donation in her mother's name. He says he never touched her. He says many things, and none of them invite the sheriff to sit. Deputies collect boots because boots tell stories. They powder soles with soot and press them into butcher paper, creating a parade of negative footprints stacked on the table. The print from the alley shows a distinctive double A of hobnails on the heel, a resole pattern sold only by Minton's Ironmongery on 6th Street. Minton produces his ledger. He has sold that pattern to 3 men in the last month: a rail yard foreman, a carpenter on the courthouse annex, and Frank Malloy, the fiancé who swears he worked across the river that night. Malloy's boots match in style but not in size, his heels are 8.5, and the alley print is 10. The sheriff notes it, but the public hears only match and fiancé, and the word fiancé becomes the shape of guilt. When he walks to the boarding house to collect a handkerchief, men follow at a distance with their hands in their pockets. They are not a mob, but the air carries that tremor. Mrs. Calder closes the door on her porch with a firm hand. The deputy county attorney, Silas Pruitt, believes he sees the arc of a case. He convenes a grand jury, and the state's witnesses file through in their Sunday coats. Lila tells her line fragment again. Harris at the pawn shop opens the locket and sets the clover in the light again, as if light can act as oath. Dr. Whitlow by now is a familiar figure. He looks tired, a tiredness that is not just from this case. In the street, rumors take a different route. They say Dr. Whitlow has been accused in another town of criminal operations, the year's euphemism for procedures women seek in fear and private rooms. The sheriff cautions his men to mind what is written down and what is said out loud. Whitlow keeps his chin level and his answers precise, and the foreman of the jury thanks him as if courtesy is disposition rather than habit. When an indictment arrives, it falls on Frank Malloy. The fiancé hears it in a boarding house hallway that smells like molasses and coal. He does not protest at first. He turns away and grips the railing, as if the wood knows his hands. He retains a lawyer named Edwin Bell, who wears a neat mustache and speaks as if each sentence is a stool set carefully on a split barn floor. Bell asks for an early trial, believing timetables can save men if witnesses tire and stories bleed. The trial opens in January, the river rimmed in thin ice that breaks like tinkling glass at the bank when the current shifts. Women pack the gallery with their gloved hands folded. The state argues jealousy, shame, and a midnight meeting behind the church. They hold up the hobnail pattern, the whisper on the switchboard, and the pawned locket as if each is a rung on a ladder that reaches one man. The prosecutor says Mary was going to tell Frank about the child that winter night and that he could not allow it. Defense attorney Bell takes the jury forward and back through time. He wheels a chalkboard and draws the size comparison of the heel print and Malloy's boot, and his chalk squeaks in the quiet. He calls the rail conductor who swears Frank rode the late freight and punched cards at 9:50 at Metropolis, and at 11:20 somewhere beyond. Could he step off at Paducah in between, the prosecutor asks. Only if he jumps a moving car, the conductor answers, and the jurors find themselves looking out the window toward the freight yard as if to see the distance. Bell calls Lila, the switchboard operator, and thanks her kindly for her dedication, then asks how many lines she supervised that hour. 16, she says. And how many times did a plug pop loose and cross two that shouldn't join? 3 or 4, she admits. Might that whisper have been for the grocer's back door, for a delivery, for anything at all, he asks. Might, she says, and in that small word the afternoon shifts. He calls Harris from the pawn shop last. Did Mary say why she pawned the locket? No, Harris says softly. Did she seem frightened or pressed? No, sir, he answers. She said she would be back Friday. What else did she say? Bell asks. Harris rubs his knuckles. She said sometimes you have to put one thing aside to keep another safe. The room fidgets, not sure what weight to give a sentence that sounds like prayer and compromise. The state produces a new witness late on the third day, a stable boy from Broadway. He says the cab returned with cinder grit and a creosote smear. He is asked to point to the man who rented it, and he cannot. He wore a cap, the boy says miserably. Like a driver. The room sighs, the kind of sound that makes a bailiff look toward the clock. It is not relief. It is a draft in a house when the front door fails to latch. When the jury retires, the sky goes gray as if the weather has been instructed to keep counsel. They return in 4 hours. Not guilty, the foreman says, watching no one. Frank does not look at the gallery. He wraps his scarf once and walks into air that smells like iron and thaw. He will leave Paducah within the month and take railroad work on a line that carries no freight we can name. What remains is not absence but residue. The sheriff keeps the butcher paper he'll print in a drawer for years. The city exchange replaces 2 wooden cord boards with a new switch that bleeds fewer lines, and Lila trains the next girl while the memory of 4 whispered words entangles her sleep. The church adds a lamppost by the rear gate. The hymns do not change, but the time between verses stretches a little as if the organist is counting something else. Dr. Whitlow faces his own hearing in March for a matter unrelated, said the judge, a word that is meant to be a wall and seldom is. Reports not the cases together in the street even when the court will not. Whitlow leaves town one night with a suitcase, not a flight so much as a dispersion. Years later someone will say he died in a small Arkansas hamlet with his hands still and his ledger empty. Records permit many endings when a man leaves in a season of rain. As for Mary's locket, her sister retrieves it from Harris with borrowed coins and tucks it into a tea tin on a shelf that smells faintly of Earl Grey and starch. The clover inside fades from green to the color of straw. The baby in the photograph remains 6 months forever, neither named nor forgotten, a face repeated quietly in certain family eyes. The tin exists long after people, as tins do. The story continues to flick its signal in quiet ways. A newspaper man writes a Sunday feature every few years and reuses the phrase, "a city losing itself between horse and electric." He adds a detail that may be wrong each time, and readers nod anyway because the shape is familiar: late shift, hatpin, carriage wheel, rear gate. He writes that investigators vowed to revisit the case when science advances, meaning fingerprint files and ballistics and the bright promise of new glass in the laboratory windows. Fingerprinting does advance in the city. The police adopt the Henry system and begin to ink right thumbs with care, then index, then roll each finger until the detective can hear the pattern on the page even before it dries. In a drawer, the butcher paper print breaks at the folds and flakes. Boots wear out in the world, and paper returns to lint. Sheriff Carter retires with a hand that trembles when he pours coffee. He says to his wife that a girl can change a town a little even in leaving. The last person to see Mary alive who admits it is neither fiancé nor clerk nor pastor. It is a woman named Mrs. Broach who keeps her rooms across from the church. She tells a reporter once, before changing her mind, not so much a plan as a posture. She saw Mary pause by the lamppost, then lean in toward a shadow near the fence like a woman who wants to hear and cannot accept that hearing might cost her something. Mrs. Broach asks the reporter not to print it. "It makes folks pick at her again," she says, "and I won't have it." The paper omits the description and leaves a gap a reader can fall through. Years pass, and the city grows around the alley with newer brick and wider eaves. The congregation relocates when a flood ruins the basement furnaces. The old church becomes a lecture hall, then a parcel where a bakery trucks its loaves at dawn through the same gate where a whisper once measured time. If you stand there long enough on a cold morning, you can smell yeast and coal, and if you are the sort to hear patterns, you will hear footfall along cinders that no longer exist. Legacies are not verdicts. They are the flotsam of what we tell and what we store. Mary Lee's case leaves at least four. First, that private lives in small places churn below the plain surface like a river under ice. Second, that technology promises clarity and delivers only more precise questions unless paired with the humility to frame them well. Third, that a woman's reputation can still be put in the dock even when she cannot speak. And fourth, that grief finds work, whether in adding a lamppost, training a new operator, or writing a name into a family Bible without saying why. When I look back at the shape of that night in 1911, I see the string of details we have taught ourselves to keep: a ledger entry, a smudge on an axle, an overheard time whispered across copper wire. I see also what falls away because wind and water insist on their own edits. The case remains unsolved not for lack of witnesses but because witnesses are people and people are weather. In the long ledger of a town, sometimes the truest thing is not the thing proved but the thing that keeps being asked.